A seasoned police officer, hardened by years on the force, believes he has seen it all. Nothing shocks him anymore, except perhaps the woman he sneers at in the middle of a tense confrontation. She's calm, she's assured, she's poised in a manner that rattles his convictions. He doesn't know her name, but he has already decided that someone like her, a black woman with a sharp tongue and unwavering confidence, must have no place in his precinct. Before the day is through, he'll discover this woman isn't just another face in the crowd, she's his new boss. And the tables are about to turn. Officer Kevin Malone had woken before dawn as he always did, the rumble of the elevated train tracks outside his tiny apartment window in Chicago's South Side serving as his reluctant alarm clock. The faint clatter of wheels on steel overhead seemed to press upon his chest, reminding him that the world demanded his attention once again. He sat up in bed, feeling the crack in his spine that signaled he wasn't quite as young as he used to be. Mid-40s, bleary-eyed and a bit jaded, Kevin had seen things in his career that had forced him to close off his heart. He downed a bitter cup of coffee, black as tar, and left his place without a second glance in the mirror. His uniform still smelled faintly of gun oil and stale sweat. Over the years, he had learned to live with the stench of tension clinging to his daily life. As a member of the Chicago Police Department, one of the busiest forces in the country, he had prided himself on being streetwise, tough, and yes, often cynical. Kevin's route to the 23rd precinct took him through neighborhoods where boarded-up storefronts shared blocks with trendy new coffee shops. Gentrification was creeping through Chicago like a slow tide. Though these changing landscapes rattled him, he often told himself his job was to keep the city safe no matter who lived here or how they changed the place. He wanted to see himself as a defender of law and order. But somewhere along the line, that sense of mission had twisted into bitterness. He was unimpressed by most people he met, and rarely had a kind word for them. He had come to rely on sweeping judgments and quick assumptions. It was how he coped, or so he would say if pressed. This was the morning he had a special assignment, a routine patrol around Michigan Avenue, near a Starbucks that had been robbed twice last month. He was to provide a visible presence. It felt like a fool's errand to him, standing around, trying to deter criminals who'd simply pick another target. But an order was an order. At the station's parking lot, he swung a leg out of his old sedan and put on his hat. Brushing a drop of the morning's drizzle from the brim, he looked up at the grey sky and grunted. "Perfect," he muttered. Rain put everyone in a foul mood, and that suited him just fine. He walked in, ignoring the cluster of younger officers shooting the breeze near the entrance. They quieted as he passed, but not out of respect, more out of discomfort. Kevin had a way of making people uneasy with his scowls and short temper, particularly those new recruits who believed in community policing and forging strong relationships with the neighborhoods they served. To him, that was soft. He saw the world as predators and prey, lawbreakers and enforcers. A bleak worldview, perhaps, but it was all he knew. "How's it going, Sarge?" asked Officer Edwards, a fresh-faced woman who had been on the force less than a year. She was standing by the coffee machine, fumbling with the filter. He gave a cursory nod and didn't reply. A quick check of the assignment board indicated he'd be partnered with Officer Rodriguez that day for the foot patrol. Rodriguez was younger, but had been at the precinct for several years. Kevin respected him in a lukewarm way. Rodriguez wasn't exactly friendly, but at least he knew how to handle himself. Taking a radio from the desk, Kevin headed for the exit again, skipping roll call because he already knew the gist. Show up on Michigan Avenue, keep an eye on everything, file a thorough report. Simple. When the drizzle turned into a cold rain outside, Kevin felt that familiar tug of exasperation. Better get this day over with, he mumbled to himself. Tasha Davis woke up that same morning in her condo overlooking Lake Michigan, a far cry from the modest row house she had grown up in. She stretched, feeling the warmth of accomplishment sink in again. This was the city she loved. She had worked hard to reach this place in every sense of the word, academically, professionally, and personally. She'd spent years dedicating herself to public service, then pursuing higher education. She graduated from Northwestern University with honors, earned a master's in criminal justice from John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York, and had recently returned to her hometown with a mission to make a difference. But Tasha's success didn't exist in a vacuum. She carried with her the frustrations and memories of seeing her own family members struggle with harsh policing tactics, some of which had been racially motivated. She recognized that systemic issues were complicated. She didn't blame every cop for every injustice. But she did believe that leadership must come from the top to change the culture of law enforcement in places like Chicago, which had a storied history of both courageous officers and corruption. She was now working closely with City Hall, having been recommended by one of the deputy mayors for a role she was excited to step into. She wouldn't just be an outsider critiquing from the sidelines. She'd be stepping into a position with real influence, though she had not publicly announced this next step. She'd soon begin a new appointment with the Chicago Police Department's administrative leadership team, spearheading community policing initiatives. Her official title was going to be Deputy Chief of Community Engagement. It was a role that she felt had real power to bring about change. Tasha checked her phone. There were a few messages from her mother, mostly supportive notes reminding her to take care of herself. She smiled. Then she noticed an email from the city about a breakfast meeting downtown. She'd set aside the next few days to ease into her role, but she had been invited to meet some mid-level staff in the department that morning. "I guess we're getting started early," she said to the empty room. Half an hour later, Tasha was in front of her mirror, adjusting a sleek black blazer and making sure the collar of her crisp white shirt lay flat. She had a stack of reference documents in her bag, all detailing recent crime statistics, community complaint patterns, and areas of improvement she wanted to bring up in future discussions with the police commissioner. She liked to be prepared for every conversation. Her father always told her, "Go in with the knowledge to lead, Tasha. Don't let them ever say you aren't ready." By 8 a.m., Tasha was in the elevator descending from her high-rise condo to the lobby, heart pounding with anticipation of the day. "Relax," she told herself. But she couldn't deny that this was one of those turning points in life. Walking through the lobby, she recognized a few neighbors who offered pleasant greetings. She tried to wave back, but her mind was already racing through possible questions she'd ask at the meeting. She had a plan. Identify the precincts with the highest community complaints, ask for more data on officer training programs, and begin crafting her recommendations for bridging the gap between the black communities on the south and west sides and the officers who patrolled them. As she emerged onto the bustling street, the swirling wind drove raindrops into her face. But Tasha's spirit was too high to be dampened. She hailed a taxi, sliding into the back seat with confidence. Her destiny was calling, and she was ready to answer. Kevin Malone and Officer Rodriguez were stationed near the busy Starbucks on Michigan Avenue, where a throng of early morning workers and tourists bustled despite the rain. Kevin's eyes were peeled for anything suspicious, particularly for anyone who looked out of place. Unfortunately, in Kevin's mind, out of place often correlated with race, age, clothing style, or even the slightest body language he deemed threatening. He believed he had a gift for reading people, but in truth, his biases painted more illusions than reality. Rodriguez was quietly scanning the crowd too. Occasionally, he'd nod at passers-by or exchange a quick hello with store owners stepping out to sweep rainwater away from their doorways. Kevin said little. He only tightened his coat as the drizzle turned into a steady downpour. That was when Tasha came into view, stepping out of a taxi half a block away. She held a sleek black umbrella that sheltered her from the rain, an expensive-looking handbag slung over her shoulder. She was heading toward a small building that housed a City Hall satellite office, though Kevin would have had no idea about that. He simply saw a confident black woman striding with purpose. Kevin's prejudice flickered to the surface. His nose wrinkled as he scanned her. Her posture, clothing, and aura suggested someone of importance, but he had already made up his mind. He'd seen a particular scenario play out countless times. In his view, someone strutting around looking like they owned the place, ignoring the fact that they might be in a neighborhood rife with petty crime. He cynically assumed she must be some well-to-do person who didn't understand the realities of the city. Tasha, meanwhile, was oblivious to the officers at first. She was intent on making it to her meeting on time. She clutched a file folder close to her chest under the umbrella and glanced at her phone's clock. A sudden commotion broke out behind Tasha. A street vendor's stand toppled over, scattering fruit across the sidewalk. Tasha spun around to see what had happened, stepping out of the direct path of the crowd. That was when Kevin's gaze locked onto her. He noticed the confusion, the swirl of people trying to avoid stepping on apples and bananas rolling across wet pavement. Kevin and Rodriguez jogged forward to help the vendor, while Tasha, concerned, bent down to pick up a few apples near her feet. "Ma'am, step back," Kevin barked, not bothering to check the situation thoroughly. The harshness of his tone made Tasha's head snap up. Rain dripped from her umbrella, splashing her shoes as she halted. Rodriguez looked over in slight discomfort. He wasn't sure if Kevin needed to be so rude. "I'm just trying to help pick up the fruit," Tasha explained politely, standing back up. She extended an apple toward the vendor with a gentle smile. "I said step back," Kevin repeated, loud enough to make onlookers pause. His face was set in stone, with that stern policeman glare that was as much intimidation as it was protocol. Tasha's eyebrows rose. She didn't appreciate the way he addressed her. "Look, officer, I'm doing nothing wrong," she stated firmly. Her eyes flicked to his badge. "Officer Malone, correct?" Kevin's jaw tightened. He didn't like the way this woman spoke so self-assuredly. "That's correct. Now move along, lady. We've got this under control." Rodriguez had already helped the vendor gather most of the items. The scene was calming, but tension brewed between Kevin and Tasha. "Don't speak to me like I'm a child," Tasha said softly but resolutely. "I'm trying to be a good citizen," Kevin snorted. The condescension in his expression was obvious. "I don't need your help. This is police business." The vendor, a wiry man in his 60s, tried to intervene. "She was just helping," he said, nodding at Tasha in thanks. "It's fine." Tasha, her shoulders squared, refused to back down. "I'm part of this community too," she said. She offered the last piece of fruit to the vendor, then turned her attention back to Kevin. "You really think it's appropriate to speak to civilians that way?" Kevin gave a brusque shrug. "I do what I have to do to keep order," he said. "Now I'm telling you one last time, move along." Rodriguez glanced uncomfortably at Tasha, trying to diffuse the situation. "Ma'am, everything's under control. We appreciate your concern." Tasha gazed at Rodriguez, noting the difference in tone between him and Kevin. "Thank you, officer," she said, refusing to let Kevin's attitude rattle her. "I hope you have a pleasant day." She turned and walked away, umbrella tilted forward, her posture unflinching under Kevin's glower. He watched her go, a mild contempt simmering inside him. In Kevin's mind, she'd tried to undermine his authority. He muttered under his breath something about arrogant busybodies, and Rodriguez shook his head, but let it go. The rain continued to pour, washing the tension into the gutter along with the spilled fruit. None of them realized how fateful this encounter truly was. Tasha's heart pounded even after she had put some distance between herself and the scene with the cops. She hated confrontations like that. It wasn't that she feared them, she just found them exhausting. Memories of her teenage years flashed in her mind. She recalled the day her younger brother had been stopped by the police just for walking home from school with a group of friends. They were all black, and they were wearing hoodies in chilly weather. That was enough to raise suspicion to certain officers. The humiliation and anger she felt that day had led her to question the fairness of policing. Yet she had never let that anger fester into hatred. Instead, it ignited her determination to change the system from within. That was why she had devoted so many years to studying criminal justice, policy, and community engagement. She believed in bridging gaps, not burning them. But that officer's attitude, his dismissiveness, it stirred up old wounds. I can't wait until I'm in a position to hold people like him accountable, she thought. The irony of that moment struck her. She was literally on her way to the precinct's administrative offices, though no one on the street had any inkling of her soon-to-be pivotal role. For a moment, Tasha's stomach churned with a tangle of nerves. Part of her wanted to march back, pull out her city identification, and say, "You'll be hearing from your new Deputy Chief of Community Engagement." But that wasn't her style. She wanted to earn respect through her work, not flaunt her title. "Calm down," she told herself, taking a deep breath as she walked into the building lobby to meet with a small group of mid-level administrators. The meeting was an informal breakfast gathering in a small conference room, with coffee and pastries set out on a table. Tasha introduced herself to the group, a few sergeants, a lieutenant, and some civilian staff who handled scheduling, outreach, and budgeting. They all knew she was about to become a key figure in the department, so they greeted her warmly, albeit with a touch of polite curiosity. For 2 hours, Tasha asked questions and listened attentively, taking copious notes. She learned about the department's current programs for community engagement, many of which had shallow support. She also heard about a new pilot program in one precinct that aimed to establish deeper relationships with youth centers. Some were enthusiastic about her arrival, believing fresh energy and ideas could help. Others were more cautious, still uncertain about how things would shift under new leadership. During a lull in the conversation, Tasha couldn't help but remember the encounter on the street. She quietly asked, "Lieutenant Bryson, how often do we train officers in conflict de-escalation?" Bryson, a kindly white-haired man with decades of service, replied, "Officially, we have modules each year. But the reality is that sometimes training sessions get cut short, or not everyone gets them at the same level of depth. And some older officers think they don't need it." Tasha nodded. "That's something I'd like to improve as soon as possible." She jotted down a note, "Mandatory de-escalation training for all ranks." Then she let the conversation move on. But in the back of her mind, she imagined Officer Malone, his dismissive glare, and how many more like him existed within these ranks. As Tasha planned her initiatives, Kevin Malone finished his shift in a foul mood. The rain had only let up toward the late afternoon, leaving him cold and soaked. To make matters worse, he couldn't get that encounter with the woman out of his head. Her unwavering composure had annoyed him more than he cared to admit. She had refused to be cowed by his authority. Later that evening, Kevin plopped down in front of his small television, flipping absently through channels while microwaving a TV dinner. His life outside of work had grown quite barren over the years. He had a string of failed relationships behind him, no children, and few close friends aside from other jaded officers. He used to have a best friend on the force, but that friend had left to join a private security firm, citing moral conflicts with the way policing was done in certain areas. Kevin felt abandoned. He coped by doubling down on his beliefs. He would have never described himself as racist in an open conversation, but his biases ran deep. He had grown up in a household where slurs and stereotypes were casually tossed around. His father, a bitter union worker who'd lost his job when the steel mills closed, blamed immigrants and big city politics for his woes. Kevin absorbed much of that resentment, taking it into his teenage years. When he joined the police academy, he found camaraderie with other recruits who likewise felt that certain neighborhoods were beyond saving. Over time, the daily stress of the job only cemented those prejudices. He rarely saw minority communities as potential allies. Instead, he saw them as trouble waiting to happen. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Rodriguez. "Hey man, just checking in. Rough day, huh?" Kevin read it and grunted, ignoring it. He didn't feel like small talk. He turned the TV volume higher, letting the evening news drone on about city council disputes and a new housing development project. Eventually, a local news feature about the police department came on, praising an officer for heroic community involvement. "Community policing," Kevin muttered under his breath. "Waste of time." He clicked the TV off in frustration, the glow of the screen fading into darkness. Kevin had no idea that, come tomorrow, he would be assigned to a shift where he'd once again cross paths with Tasha Davis, this time under very different circumstances. The next morning, Tasha received an email from the commissioner's office. She was invited to join the upcoming precinct briefing at the 23rd precinct the following day, where she'd be introduced to the supervising officers. The email stated that it would be a more formal occasion, a chance to outline her vision for community engagement. It asked her to come prepared to speak briefly. Tasha's stomach fluttered with anticipation. This was it, the next big step. She spent the day drafting her talking points, focusing on unity and accountability. She believed that by setting a tone of mutual respect, the conversation could shift from us versus them to a collective sense of duty. She meticulously wrote out bullet points, emphasize empathy and understanding in every interaction, address implicit biases through structured training, collaborate with community leaders to identify issues before they escalate, create a transparent reporting process for officer misconduct. Little did Tasha know that Kevin Malone was stationed at the 23rd precinct. He was supposed to attend that same briefing where she would be introduced. Neither Tasha nor Kevin had any inkling of the seismic shift that was about to shake Kevin's world. That evening, Tasha decided to reward herself with a quiet dinner at a local restaurant. She loved the Purple Pig on Michigan Avenue. Yes, an actual Chicago spot. She had gone there many times during her college days and always enjoyed its eclectic menu. Sitting alone at a table near a window, she allowed herself a single glass of wine, savoring the moment of calm before what she sensed would be a whirlwind of challenges. Outside, pedestrians hurried by in the cold night air. Tasha watched them, wondering how many might have had an experience similar to hers, run-ins with condescending officers or dismissive officials. How many bright minds, especially among black youth, had turned bitter because of daily indignities. She felt a renewed surge of commitment. Tomorrow, she'd step into that precinct and maybe, just maybe, begin to sow seeds of change. The morning came, crisp and slightly cloudy. Tasha dressed carefully, opting for a charcoal grey pantsuit and sensible heels. She pinned an ID badge to her lapel, indicating her affiliation with the CPD's administrative branch. Her heart raced as she approached the 23rd precinct. The building was unremarkable, a brick facade with small windows. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the battered desks and scuffed linoleum floors. She was greeted by Lieutenant Bryson, the kindly older officer she'd met during the breakfast meeting. "Morning, Miss Davis," he said, offering a handshake. "We're gathered in the briefing room down the hall." She followed him into a large room where about 24 officers were seated, including some sergeants, a few lieutenants, and other administrative staff. A podium stood at the front. Tasha took a moment to let her gaze drift across the room. She recognized a few faces from the breakfast meeting. Then she saw him, Officer Kevin Malone, sitting near the back with crossed arms, scowling slightly. It took her a second to place him as the officer from 2 days ago. The flicker of shock and recognition in her eyes was mirrored by Kevin, whose jaw visibly tensed when he realized who she was. Lieutenant Bryson cleared his throat. "Everyone, can I have your attention?" The low murmur of side conversations died down. "This morning, we have a special guest, or rather, an important new member of our leadership team. Miss Tasha Davis has joined our ranks as Deputy Chief of Community Engagement, reporting directly to the Commissioner. She's here to introduce herself and give us an outline of some upcoming initiatives that will be rolled out citywide. Let's give her a warm welcome." Some officers clapped politely. Others, like Kevin, merely shifted in their seats. Tasha stepped up to the podium, her voice steady. She introduced herself, summarized her background, and laid out her vision in a concise manner. She spoke of forging partnerships with local communities, building trust, and enhancing officer training. She emphasized that her goal was not to criticize or undermine, but to strengthen the bond between the department and the people it served. The reaction in the room was mixed. Some nodded in agreement, others remained stoic. Kevin Malone stared intently, arms crossed over his chest. He recognized the quiet fire in Tasha's eyes, the same steely resolve he'd seen on the street. Now it made sense. She wasn't just some passerby. She was a big shot in the department, his boss in certain respects. A wave of indignation and embarrassment washed over him. Great. The woman I basically told off is now in a position of power, he thought bitterly. He barely heard her concluding remarks, something about scheduling one-on-one meet and greets with officers to hear their concerns and insights. When she stepped away from the podium, the room broke into small applause again. As the meeting wrapped up, Tasha moved through the group, shaking hands and exchanging introductions. Kevin tried to slip out unobtrusively, but Lieutenant Bryson called him over. "Officer Malone, Miss Davis, I'd like you two to meet," Bryson said, smiling cordially. Kevin forced a thin smile, while Tasha maintained an air of professionalism. She extended her hand. "Officer Malone, nice to officially meet you," she said. There was a flicker in her eyes that told him she remembered their previous encounter. Kevin hesitated, then shook her hand, his grip firm. "Likewise," he replied tersely. Bryson, oblivious to the undercurrent, turned to Tasha. "Officer Malone has been with the precinct for years. He has extensive experience on the streets, especially in high-crime areas." "Good," Tasha replied without missing a beat, releasing Kevin's hand. "I'd love to schedule some time with you, Officer Malone, to hear your insights." Kevin only nodded, swallowing the knot in his throat. Then, as Tasha turned to greet other officers, Kevin fixed his gaze on her back. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined that this particular woman would outrank him. He felt cornered, angry, but a hint of fear also tugged at his chest. After all, he'd made quite a bad first impression, and she seemed the type who wouldn't forget it. In the days that followed, Tasha began her rounds, holding short meetings with officers to understand their perspectives. She met with each squad, sat in on briefings, and asked about their experiences on patrol. She tried to make each interaction constructive, focusing on actionable insights. When it was Kevin's turn, he showed up to her temporary office, an unused meeting room in the precinct. Despite his trepidation, he carried himself with a stiff confidence. Tasha greeted him politely and invited him to sit. "Thank you for coming, Officer Malone," she began. "I know we've spoken in passing, but I wanted a dedicated time for us to discuss any concerns, ideas, or suggestions you might have regarding community engagement." Kevin took a breath, deciding to tread carefully. He wasn't used to being diplomatic, but he recognized that this woman had the ear of the commissioner. "I've been on the force a long time," he said. "I've seen programs come and go, A lot of them sound good on paper, but they don't pan out. The communities we deal with don't trust us. And frankly, a lot of them make trouble for themselves. Tasha arched an eyebrow, but maintained a neutral tone. And why do you think that is? Kevin shrugged. Look, I'm not saying we're perfect, but I also think there's a culture of non-cooperation out there. People don't like the police. They don't want to talk to us until something goes wrong. Then we're the bad guys. Tasha leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. I hear you. Trust is a two-way street, Officer Malone. Sometimes we have to be the ones to extend our hands first, consistently, and with sincerity. He stared at her, feeling his temper stir. And what happens if they spit in our faces? Or worse, shoot at us. We have to protect ourselves. Tasha nodded thoughtfully. Of course. Officer safety is paramount. But forming bonds can reduce the likelihood of those violent interactions. Some neighborhoods feel alienated or harassed by the police. By building trust, we can diminish those hostilities. Kevin's mouth twisted in a skeptical frown. A surge of defiance rose in him. I'll follow the rules. But I've got my own style. The streets don't operate on a college textbook. She could have been offended by his remark, but she chose to remain calm. I respect real-world experience. That's why I want your input on how best to implement new training. So tell me, how would you improve current approaches? He hesitated, uncertain if she was genuinely asking or setting a trap. Finally, he spoke again. Officers need to know they're backed up by the brass. If you want them to be friendlier, you have to reassure them that you won't leave them out to dry when complaints come in. Tasha softened her posture. Fair point. Accountability can't be one-sided. Officers need fair representation, but accountability also means recognizing harmful behavior when it happens. We can't ignore problems. Kevin's eyes flickered with a flash of guilt or fear. He wasn't sure which. Did she suspect him of misconduct? Was she referencing their own confrontation? The conversation ended soon after, both of them maintaining a fragile politeness. As Kevin left, Tasha sat back, letting out a quiet breath. It was going to be a challenge working with officers like him, yet she believed patience and persistence could sway even the most stubborn mindsets if they gave her a chance. 2 weeks later, tensions erupted. Tasha had begun implementing her first major initiative, a training workshop on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques, mandatory for all precincts. Kevin, forced to attend, sulked through the sessions. He found the trainer's approach condescending and the group exercises pointless. During one role-play scenario, an instructor asked each officer to simulate responding to a volatile domestic disturbance without resorting to immediate force. Kevin found the exercise naive. He refused to follow the script, leading to a sharp exchange of words with the instructor in front of the entire group. Tasha, observing from the back, noted Kevin's defiance with concern. Afterward, Tasha approached Kevin privately. Officer Malone, can I speak to you a moment? He rolled his eyes but nodded, following her into a hallway. Yes, Miss Davis? His tone was clipped. I'm noticing some resistance to these exercises, she said carefully. Because they're unrealistic, he retorted. We don't have time to coddle people when they're screaming or brandishing weapons. No one's saying to coddle criminals, Tasha replied, controlling her frustration. These exercises are about reducing tension, preventing escalations, and using communication as a tool before resorting to physical force. I'd like to see you give it a fair shot, he huffed. I've got 15 years on the streets telling me what works. With all due respect, Miss Davis, your fancy degrees and well-intentioned lectures won't change that. Tasha's face hardened. I appreciate your experience, but this is non-negotiable. The department's leadership supports these measures fully. If you can't adapt, there may be consequences. He glared at her, taking a step closer. "Is that a threat?" "Not at all," she said, matching his glare with unwavering calm. "It's a reality. Things are changing, Officer Malone. The question is whether you'll come on board." Kevin said nothing more, turning away and stomping down the corridor. Tasha watched him go, her heart pounding. Part of her wanted to rage at his obstinance, but she reminded herself that this was the exact culture she was here to address. The weeks rolled on, and Kevin's resentment simmered. He saw Tasha as a meddling outsider, flipping the script on how policing was supposed to be done. By contrast, Tasha's changes were gradually taking root with other officers. Many younger cops appreciated the emphasis on relationship building and found themselves less stressed on patrol. Complaints against the precinct began to dip slightly. Preliminary data suggested the new initiatives were making a difference. Then came the night that changed everything. Kevin was on a late shift, patrolling the south side. He responded to a reported break-in at a small grocery store. Upon arriving, he found a terrified shop owner cowering behind the counter and a man rummaging through aisles. Kevin drew his firearm, the adrenaline spike making his pulse thunder. He shouted for the suspect to come out with his hands up. The suspect emerged. He was unarmed, a young black man trembling with fear. Kevin immediately advanced, yelling contradictory commands, and the man panicked. Raising his arms in terror, Kevin shoved him against a shelf, pinned him, then cuffed him roughly, ignoring the pleas that the man was merely a desperate father trying to get diapers for his infant. Officer Rodriguez, who had arrived on the scene as backup, saw the entire exchange. He noticed how Kevin's aggression escalated the situation far beyond what was necessary. The suspect wasn't resisting, yet Kevin pressed his knee into the man's back, cursing under his breath. Eventually, they dragged the suspect up, the shop owner verifying that the young man had broken in after hours but had not threatened him with any weapon. Rodriguez insisted on taking the suspect to the station, telling Kevin to cool off. Kevin, still fueled by anger, spat at the ground in disgust, another low life in his eyes. What Kevin didn't realize was that the store's security camera had captured the entire encounter, including the excessive force. Days later, the footage went public through a local news channel that had begun investigating allegations of police misconduct. It ignited a firestorm of outrage in the community, calling for immediate accountability. Tasha found herself at the center of the storm. Media demanded answers from the police commissioner's office. Community activists were outraged, citing the video as further proof that the CPD needed deep reform. Internal Affairs launched an investigation into Kevin's actions. Suddenly, Kevin Malone was suspended pending the results of the inquiry. He sat at home, chain-smoking cigarettes, furious at the department for what he perceived as caving to public pressure. He refused to believe he had done anything wrong. In his mind, he had neutralized a criminal, plain and simple. Yet the wheels of accountability were turning. Tasha, now heavily involved, had the unpleasant duty of reviewing the footage and recommending disciplinary actions. Her stomach twisted when she saw Kevin's unnecessary force. It was exactly the kind of behavior she had hoped to prevent or eradicate through training. A departmental hearing was convened. Tasha, along with internal affairs officers, the commissioner, and a police union representative, sat in a large conference room. Kevin entered, flanked by his union rep. His eyes were red with lack of sleep and anger. He stared daggers at Tasha as he took his seat. The hearing proceeded with the footage being played. Kevin's union rep tried to argue that the suspect might have been armed, that Kevin had reason to fear for his safety, but the video clearly showed the suspect's hands raised. No weapon in sight. The contrast between the suspect's surrender and Kevin's aggression was undeniable. After hours of testimony and discussion, Kevin was found to have used excessive force. The official recommendation was a suspension without pay for 3 months, mandatory retraining, and a final warning that any further misconduct would lead to immediate termination. It was a severe penalty, one that could jeopardize Kevin's future in the force if he didn't comply. Kevin seethed silently as the verdict was read. When the room cleared, Tasha lingered, feeling the weight of the situation. She had played a role in this decision, though it was the Commissioner and Internal Affairs who ultimately determined the punishment. Kevin lingered too, glaring at her. For a moment, neither spoke. She broke the silence. "Officer Malone, I hope you understand, this isn't personal. But the department can't ignore what happened." His nostrils flared. "You got what you wanted, didn't you? Another bad cop to parade around, show the public that you're cleaning house." Tasha's voice shook slightly with emotion. "It's not about parading anyone around. It's about doing what's right." He laughed bitterly. "What's right? What do you know about what's right on these streets?" "I've lived in these streets," Tasha shot back, her voice steadying. "I've seen them from both sides." "I'm not naive, Officer Malone. I know how tough this job can be. But I also know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of unnecessary hostility. And it has to stop." Kevin had no response to that. After a moment, he turned on his heel and walked out. Outside, cameras flashed, reporters bombarding him with questions. He pushed past them, his face grim. This was the public shame he had always feared. Months passed. Kevin's suspension forced him into isolation. Bills piled up, and he had to take a part-time job doing security at a warehouse to stay afloat. He despised every minute of it, feeling humiliated and betrayed by the very institution he had served for so long. But in the cold nights of that warehouse, a seed of introspection began to sprout. He started watching the news coverage of his incident from a more detached viewpoint. He saw the terrified suspect's face. He replayed his own words and actions, and despite every instinct to justify himself, he felt a pang of remorse. He recalled the times in his career when he might have crossed lines or belittled civilians for no reason other than his own anger. He remembered Tasha's words, "It's about doing what's right." For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had let his prejudices overshadow his sworn duty to protect and serve. Meanwhile, Tasha continued her work, expanding the community engagement programs. She faced her own challenges, budget constraints, political bickering, and pushback from certain union officials. But she pushed forward, championing youth outreach, officer mentorship, and revised training protocols. Gradually, more officers embraced her vision, especially when they saw results, neighborhoods cooperating more, fewer violent confrontations, and a slight boost in morale. When Kevin's suspension ended, he was required to attend a comprehensive retraining program, ironically overseen by Tasha and a team of instructors. The day he returned, he walked into the training room with less hostility than before. Tasha stood at the front, briefing the group. Their eyes met. She offered a nod of acknowledgement, not triumph. During a break, Kevin approached Tasha. He cleared his throat, his gaze shifting awkwardly. "Miss Davis," he began, voice subdued. She set down a binder. "Officer Malone," she replied, maintaining a professional tone. "I just wanted to say that I'm here to do the training," he said. "I don't agree with everything, but I realize I don't have a choice." Tasha's eyes softened. "I'm glad you're here. Hopefully you'll find some parts of it worthwhile." He nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. He wanted to say more, maybe an apology. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he mumbled something about seeing her later and walked off. In the weeks that followed, Kevin grudgingly participated in the role plays, discussions, and lectures. At first, he was sullen, but he couldn't deny that some of the techniques, like giving a suspect space to comply instead of rushing them, were sensible. He even found himself reflecting on how many volatile calls he had responded to over the years that might have ended less traumatically had he used a calmer approach. One afternoon, Tasha led a session on cultural competency and understanding implicit bias. She guided the officers through a discussion on how stereotypes form, how they can impede effective policing, and how to remain alert to them. Kevin felt uncomfortable. The conversation stirred up memories of his father's racist remarks and the environment he grew up in. When Tasha asked for volunteers to share personal experiences, Kevin found his hand rising almost involuntarily. He spoke haltingly, explaining how he had grown up hearing negative stereotypes and how, over time, they seemed to be confirmed by the criminals he arrested. I got so used to seeing certain faces in these neighborhoods, I guess I just started seeing everyone there the same way, he admitted, looking down. I don't know how to fix that overnight. Tasha listened intently. Acknowledging it is the first step, she said gently. We can't change what we don't confront. In that moment, Kevin felt a weight lift from his chest. The hardest part was admitting that the woman he had once disrespected, the one he had ridiculed for being arrogant, was actually helping him face his own demons. He didn't know if he liked it, but he couldn't deny it was happening. By the time Kevin completed his retraining, he had a new perspective, albeit still tinged with cynicism. He returned to active duty under close supervision, paired with Officer Rodriguez once again. His first few shifts were unremarkable traffic stops, noise complaints, a domestic dispute, but each time, Kevin tried applying some of the de-escalation techniques. He still felt the urge to lash out when suspects mouthed off, but he bit his tongue and followed the script. To his surprise, it often worked. Suspects complied more readily when he didn't immediately jump down their throats. He began to see glimpses of Tasha's logic. Trust wasn't built with a single conversation. It was a repeated effort to treat people with decency, even in difficult situations. One night, Tasha visited the precinct to check in on the officers and gather feedback for her next report to the commissioner. She found Kevin filling out paperwork at a desk. Approaching him, she offered a short smile. "How's it going, Officer Malone?" He looked up, hesitating. Then he replied, "Not bad. Getting used to some changes." She perched on the edge of a neighboring desk, arms folded. "That's good to hear. Your name came up in a positive context recently. I heard from Officer Rodriguez that you handled a tense situation last week with a pretty measured approach. I wanted to say thank you." Kevin shrugged, a hint of color rising to his cheeks. "I guess those training exercises aren't completely useless," he admitted with a half smile. Tasha nodded, and for a moment there was a profound silence between them, filled with shared understanding. The journey from antagonism to grudging respect had been far from smooth, but it was real. Kevin was still Kevin, cautious, sometimes gruff, but he had begun to shed the hardened shell of prejudice. "Let me know if there's anything else you need," Tasha said, standing up. "I want to make sure every officer feels supported as we move forward." He looked at her, his expression earnest for the first time. "I appreciate that," he said quietly. Time revealed the full scope of the karmic circle. Kevin had lost much of his pride and reputation, but in doing so had gained an opportunity to confront his own biases and become a better officer. He had faced public shame, a suspension, and mandatory retraining, harsh karma indeed. Yet that harshness had cracked open his defenses, allowing a new awareness to seep in. Tasha, on the other hand, had achieved what she set out to do, at least partially. She had proven that accountability was possible, even for veteran officers. She had introduced programs that reduced tensions in high-crime areas, and she had done so without demonizing all police, showing that real change required empathy for everyone involved. Over time, Kevin's hostility toward Tasha mellowed into something approaching respect. He didn't exactly become her staunch ally overnight, but he followed the new protocols and even contributed ideas for further improvements. Meanwhile, Tasha continued her relentless drive for reform, forging alliances within the department and the community. In a fateful twist, the once prejudiced cop who had ridiculed a black woman on the street ended up working under her leadership, learning invaluable lessons about humility, empathy, and the power of second chances. As the city of Chicago navigated a new era of policing, their story stood as a testament. Sometimes, the people you dismiss or mistreat hold the very keys to your own growth. Thank you for listening to this powerful story of redemption, resilience, and real change. Officer Kevin Malone learned the hard way that our prejudices can blind us to our duty, while Tasha Davis showed the transformative power of calm, confident leadership. Their journey reminds us that progress isn't always smooth, but it's possible when we confront our biases and strive to see one another's humanity. If this tale inspired you, if it made you think, reflect, or even feel a spark of hope, then please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with friends and family who need to hear this message, and make sure to subscribe for more captivating stories of transformation and second chances. By engaging with this channel, you help spread a vision of justice, compassion, and accountability. Thank you for being a part of this journey.